Welcome, fellow seekers of the supernatural, to another spine-chilling episode of the Haunted Lore podcast. Today we're traveling to the wealthy suburb of Houghton in Johannesburg, South Africa, where luxury meets terror, and where one of the most notorious criminal safehouses in African history became something far more sinister. Picture this. An elegant house in one of Johannesburg's most exclusive neighborhoods, where champagne flowed freely, servants catered to every whim, and money was never a concern. But beneath this veneer of luxury lurked a darkness that would forever stain these walls with blood, desperation, and something that refuses to rest. Today, we delve into the haunting tale of the Stander Gang's safehouse, a story that begins with betrayal, spirals through bank robberies and high-speed chases, and ends in a hail of gunfire that some say continues to echo through the halls of this cursed residence. The events that unfolded here in January 1984 were so violent, so desperate, that they seemed to have torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself, leaving behind restless spirits and an atmosphere so heavy with dread that even the bravest visitors flee in terror. So dim the lights, settle in and prepare yourself for a journey into one of South Africa's most haunted locations, where crime, tragedy, and the supernatural collide in the most terrifying way possible. What makes a police captain turn to bank robbery? To understand the horror that would eventually consume the Houghton safehouse, we must first understand the man whose darkness created it. Andre Stander was a disillusioned Johannesburg police officer in the late 1970s who turned his back on the laws he swore to enforce and started robbing banks. But what could drive a respected police captain to such desperate measures? Andre Stander was no ordinary criminal. Born into privilege and rising through the ranks of the South African police, he was the youngest captain on the force, newly married, and seemingly destined for greatness. But beneath this polished exterior, something dark was festering. The brutality of apartheid-era South Africa, the corruption he witnessed daily, and his own psychological demons created a perfect storm of disillusionment. In 1977, Stander flew to Durban and robbed his first bank, not out of financial desperation, but seemingly for the thrill and as an act of rebellion against the system he served. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a police captain, actively investigating bank robberies by day while committing them during his lunch breaks and days off. The psychological profile of Stander reveals a man consumed by contradictions. He would rob a bank in the morning, then return to work to investigate his own crime, often arriving at the scene while it was still being processed. The twisted irony wasn't lost on him. He seemed to derive perverse pleasure from fooling his colleagues and staying one step ahead of the very system he represented. But what makes Stander's transformation truly chilling is how completely he embraced his new identity. This wasn't a man who stumbled into crime. This was a calculated descent into darkness. He studied bank security, memorized guard rotations, and used his police knowledge to stay ahead of investigations. Every robbery was meticulously planned, every escape route carefully mapped. The psychological toll of living this double life began to show. Colleagues noticed his increasing cynicism, his dark humor, and his strange detachment from cases involving bank robberies. What they didn't realize was that they were witnessing the slow disintegration of a man's moral compass, a transformation that would eventually lead to the creation of one of South Africa's most notorious criminal enterprises. When Stander was finally caught and sentenced to prison, most assumed his story was over. They were terrifyingly wrong. Prison wasn't his end. It was his beginning. For it was behind bars that Andre Stander would meet two men who would help him create a criminal legacy so violent and desperate that it would leave supernatural scars on the very walls that contained them. Who were the men behind South Africa's most notorious bank robbery spree? The transformation from lone wolf bank robber to the leader of South Africa's most feared criminal gang happened in the most unlikely of places, behind prison walls. By the time Andre Stander, ex-police captain and convicted bank robber, arrived at the prison, Alan Hale was well advanced with his plan to escape. What followed was a partnership forged in desperation and sealed in violence. Alan Hale was everything Stander wasn't, a career criminal with a reputation for both intelligence and ruthlessness. Where Stander brought police expertise and inside knowledge of law enforcement tactics, Hale contributed street smarts and an intricate understanding of criminal operations. The third member of their unholy trinity was Lee McCall, a man whose desperation would ultimately seal his fate in the most horrific way imaginable. Lee McCall was a member of the Stander Gang, a group of 3 escaped convicts who went on a bank robbing spree in South Africa from October 1983 until February 1984. But McCall was more than just another criminal. He was a man haunted by his own demons, whose growing paranoia and increasing instability would eventually transform their Houghton safehouse into a pressure cooker of fear and desperation. The dynamic between these 3 men was toxic from the beginning. Stander, with his police background and natural leadership abilities, assumed command. Hale, calculating and ambitious, saw an opportunity to execute the most audacious criminal enterprise in South African history. McCall, increasingly unstable and violent, became the wild card that none of them could control. Stander and McCall gave Hale 3 weeks of luxury at their safe house in Houghton, enjoying good food, servants, and alcohol. This wasn't just criminal hospitality, it was a deliberate psychological operation. Stander understood that luxury could be as corrupting as desperation, and he used both the Houghton safehouse and its amenities to bind his accomplices to their criminal enterprise. But what made this trio truly dangerous wasn't just their individual skills, it was their complete abandonment of moral constraints. The 3 escaped from prison and began robbing banks. The media soon coined the name Stander Gang in reference to them. They weren't just robbing banks, they were terrorizing an entire nation, striking with such frequency and audacity that they became household names. The trio then embarked on a 3-month bank robbery spree, netting more than 500,000 rand in 20 robberies. To put this in perspective, they were averaging more than 1 bank robbery per week, accumulating a fortune that allowed them to maintain their luxurious lifestyle in the Houghton safehouse. The psychological pressure of maintaining such an intense criminal operation began to take its toll. Paranoia set in. Trust eroded. The very success that allowed them to afford their palatial hideout also made them targets of the largest manhunt in South African history. Every knock at the door could be their last. Every phone call could signal betrayal. Every night could be their final night of freedom. It was in this atmosphere of mounting tension and creeping dread that the Houghton safehouse began to feel less like a luxury retreat and more like a gilded prison. The walls that protected them from the outside world also trapped them with their own growing fears and suspicions. And in such an environment, it was only a matter of time before the darkness they had invited in would consume them entirely. What turned a luxury hideout into a house of horror? The Houghton safehouse wasn't chosen randomly. It was selected with the calculated precision that defined everything the Stander gang did. Located in one of Johannesburg's most exclusive neighborhoods, the house offered the perfect combination of luxury and anonymity. Wealthy residents minded their own business, private security was discreet, and the last place anyone would look for dangerous criminals was among the mansions of the elite. But what made this location perfect for hiding also made it perfect for trapping. The high walls that provided privacy also prevented escape. The isolated location that offered security also meant that screams for help would go unheard. The luxury that attracted them would ultimately become their tomb. Several call girls who the gang had employed at their safe house from time to time assisted the police in locating the hideout. This detail reveals the depth of their paranoia-inducing lifestyle. The gang's need for companionship and normalcy led them to bring outsiders into their sanctuary, but these very relationships would eventually become the threads that unraveled their carefully constructed world of secrecy. The psychological atmosphere inside the safe house was becoming increasingly toxic. A video rental contract they had taken out shows that they found time to watch movies such as A Dangerous Man, Madman, Trapped, Escape from New York, and Thief. Even their entertainment choices reflected their growing obsession with violence, entrapment, and desperation. Art was imitating life in the most disturbing way possible. As January 1984 approached, the walls of the safe house seemed to be closing in. The gang members were making exit plans. Stander was traveling to Cape Town to purchase a boat. Hale was planning to flee to Greece, and McCall was growing increasingly unstable. The luxury that had once bound them together was now suffocating them with its implications. Every expensive item was evidence of their crimes. Every comfortable moment was borrowed time. The servants who maintained their lavish lifestyle became unwitting witnesses to their deteriorating mental states. Imagine the horror of working in a house where the very people you served were capable of the most violent crimes, where tensions ran so high that a single wrong word could trigger catastrophic violence. The staff reported an increasingly oppressive atmosphere, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But it wasn't just the psychological pressure that was transforming the safe house into a house of horror. The very success of their criminal enterprise had made them prisoners of their own making. They couldn't leave without abandoning their fortune. They couldn't stay without facing capture. They couldn't trust anyone, including each other. In their desperate attempt to create a sanctuary, they had constructed a trap from which there seemed to be no escape. The irony was suffocating. Men who had spent their careers robbing others of their security had created a prison of insecurity for themselves. The wealth they had stolen couldn't buy them peace. The luxury they had murdered for couldn't purchase them safety. And in the end, the very house that was supposed to be their salvation would become the stage for their destruction. As the net closed around them, the Houghton safehouse transformed from a haven into a horror. The walls that had witnessed their celebrations would soon witness their desperation. The rooms that had echoed with laughter would soon ring with gunfire. And the house that had sheltered them would soon become their tomb, a tomb that, according to local legend, they have never truly left. How did three bank robbers terrorize an entire nation? On the 19th of January 1984, the Stander gang robs three banks in less than an hour in the Johannesburg city centre. This wasn't just another day of criminal activity. This was the culmination of a reign of terror that had paralyzed South Africa's financial system and captured the terrified imagination of an entire nation. To understand the scope of their impact, we must appreciate the sheer audacity of their operations. Brigadier Mani van Rensburg, head of robbery and homicide, had ordered every policeman in Johannesburg to be on the lookout for the Stander gang, a trio of escaped prisoners who had been robbing banks since August, sometimes 4 a day. 4 banks in a single day. This level of criminal activity was unprecedented in South African history. The psychological warfare they waged was as devastating as their physical crimes. Bank employees reported nightmares about the gang. Customers avoided certain branches that had been targeted. The entire banking industry was forced to overhaul their security procedures. Insurance companies raised premiums. The economy itself began to feel the ripple effects of their terror campaign. But what made the Stander gang truly terrifying wasn't just their frequency or their success rate. It was their complete unpredictability. Stander's police background gave him insights into law enforcement thinking that allowed the gang to stay one step ahead of every investigation. They would strike when least expected, disappear without a trace, and reappear somewhere else entirely, leaving investigators chasing shadows. The media coverage of their exploits only added to their mythical status. Newspapers competed to report their latest heists. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with updates on their activities. Television news led with their stories. In a perverse way, they had become celebrities, dangerous, fascinating figures who represented both the ultimate rebellion against authority and the complete breakdown of social order. Their impact extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families locked their doors earlier. Business owners installed additional security measures. The psychological climate of fear they created affected millions of people who would never encounter them directly, but lived in terror of what they represented. The complete failure of law enforcement to protect society from its most dangerous elements. As their crime spree continued, the psychological pressure on all sides intensified. Law enforcement officials faced growing public criticism for their inability to capture the gang. Politicians demanded results. Media coverage became increasingly hysterical. And in the Houghton safehouse, 3 men counted their stolen money while planning their escapes, unaware that their reign of terror was about to come to a violent and supernatural end. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be unlike anything in South African criminal history. A battle that would leave 1 man dead, 2 others fleeing to opposite ends of the earth, and a house forever haunted by the violence it had witnessed. What happens when desperation meets police firepower? McCall was killed on 30th of January 1984 in a police raid on the gang's hideout in Houghton estate. But the bare facts of that date cannot begin to convey the horror of what actually transpired within those walls. A horror so intense that many believe it permanently stained the spiritual atmosphere of the house itself. The raid didn't happen by accident. Several call girls who the gang had employed at their safe house from time to time assisted the police in locating the hideout. The very relationships that had provided the gang members with companionship and a semblance of normalcy became the instruments of their downfall. Trust, that most precious commodity in a criminal enterprise, had been shattered from within. As police surrounded the Houghton safehouse in the pre-dawn hours of January 30th, 1984, the luxury that had once symbolized the gang's success became a death trap. The high walls that had provided privacy now prevented escape. The isolated location that had offered security now meant that Lee McCall was completely alone with his terror and desperation. The psychological state of the trapped gang member can only be imagined. McCall had watched his partners make their escape plans, Stander to America, Hale to Europe, while he remained behind, essentially abandoned to face the consequences of their collective crimes. The man who had shared in the luxury of their stolen fortune was now left to face the full weight of law enforcement's vengeance. Witnesses reported hearing the chaos that erupted as police stormed the safehouse. The sound of splintering wood as doors were kicked in, the shouting of commands, the thunder of boots on expensive floors, and then the gunfire. Shots that seemed to echo not just through the house, but through time itself, creating reverberations that some claim can still be heard today. The three then began a crime spree, which ended on January 30th, 1984, when McCall was killed in a shootout with police. But calling it simply a shootout sanitizes the desperate violence that actually occurred. This was a man cornered like a wild animal, knowing that capture meant life imprisonment or death, fighting with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. The house that had witnessed so much luxury and celebration was suddenly transformed into a war zone. Bullets shattered windows, splintered furniture, and embedded themselves in walls. The elegant rooms that had hosted criminal planning sessions became a battlefield where desperation met overwhelming force. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the raid was what happened in those final moments. According to police reports and local legend, McCall's final act wasn't one of surrender or even continued resistance. It was an act of such desperate finality that it forever changed the spiritual atmosphere of the house. Some say he took his own life rather than face capture. Others claim he was gunned down while making a final futile attempt at escape. The aftermath was almost as traumatic as the raid itself. Blood stained the expensive carpets. Bullet holes scarred the walls. The luxury items that had been purchased with stolen money were now evidence in a criminal investigation. The house that had been their sanctuary was now a crime scene, sealed off and haunted by the violence it had witnessed. But what makes this tragedy even more disturbing is what happened to the spiritual atmosphere of the house. Staff members who returned to clean up reported an oppressive feeling, as if the very air was thick with residual terror and desperation. Visitors described sudden temperature drops, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by hostile, unseen presences. The violent end to the Stander gang's reign of terror had done more than just eliminate a criminal threat. It had apparently torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself, allowing something dark and malevolent to take up permanent residence in the Houghton safehouse. Why do some houses never forget their darkest moments? The police raid that ended Lee McCall's life should have been the conclusion of the Stander gang's story. The criminals were dead or fled. Justice had been served, and life should have returned to normal in the exclusive Houghton neighborhood. But according to local residents and paranormal investigators, the violence that occurred within those walls was so intense, so desperate, that it left permanent scars on the very fabric of reality. The psychological trauma experienced in the moments before McCall's death was unlike anything most people can imagine. Picture the terror of a man who knows he's trapped, that his partners have abandoned him, that his life of luxury and crime is about to end in the most violent way possible. The emotional energy released in such moments of absolute desperation doesn't simply disappear. According to paranormal theory, it becomes imprinted on the environment itself. Local residents began reporting strange occurrences almost immediately after the raid. The house, which had been a symbol of criminal success, became a source of neighborhood dread. Real estate agents found it impossible to sell. Potential buyers would enter with enthusiasm but leave pale and shaken, speaking of oppressive atmospheres and unexplained feelings of terror. The servants who had worked in the house during the gang's occupation provided some of the most chilling accounts. They described returning to collect their belongings and being overwhelmed by sensations that something malevolent still occupied the premises. Rooms that had once been filled with laughter and criminal planning now felt heavy with menace. The very air seemed thick with residual desperation and fear. But it wasn't just emotional impressions that visitors reported. There were physical manifestations that defied rational explanation. Sudden temperature drops in specific rooms, particularly in areas where the most violent confrontations had occurred. Unexplained sounds, footsteps in empty hallways, doors closing without human intervention, and, most disturbing of all, what sounded like muffled gunshots echoing through the house at the exact time the raid had occurred. Paranormal investigators who studied the house theorized that the combination of factors present during the raid created perfect conditions for a permanent haunting. The extreme emotional trauma, the violent death, the sense of betrayal and abandonment, and the criminal activities that had taken place there combined to create what experts call a spiritual perfect storm. The most unsettling reports came from those brave enough to spend extended time in the house. They described an overwhelming sense of being watched, particularly in the areas where McCall had made his final stand. Some reported feeling a presence that seemed to radiate desperate anger, not just at the police who had cornered him, but at the partners who had left him to face their collective fate alone. Local folklore began to develop around the house, with neighbors sharing stories of lights flickering on and off in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be electrical problems. Some claimed to see shadows moving behind curtains in windows of the supposedly empty house. Others reported hearing what sounded like heated arguments coming from within, as if the gang members were still there, still planning their next heist, still trapped in their cycle of criminal desperation. The psychological impact on the neighborhood was profound. Property values in the immediate area began to decline. Longtime residents spoke of feeling uncomfortable when walking past the house, as if they were being observed by malevolent, unseen watchers. The exclusive atmosphere of Houghton was forever changed by the presence of this dark landmark. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports from those who claimed to have encountered McCall's spirit directly. These witnesses described a presence that seemed consumed with rage and desperation. A man still fighting a battle he had lost decades ago, still searching for escape from a trap that death itself couldn't break. The house has also become a magnet for what paranormal experts call dark tourism. Visitors drawn by the combination of criminal history and supernatural reputation. However, many of these curious explorers report experiences that go far beyond their expectations. Some describe feeling physically ill within minutes of entering the property. Others report sudden panic attacks with no apparent trigger. A few have claimed to experience what they believe were actual encounters with McCall's spirit, a presence they describe as radiating desperate anger and unresolved fear. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from those who claim to have experienced what paranormal investigators call time slips, moments where visitors seem to temporarily experience events from the house's dark past. These individuals describe suddenly finding themselves in the middle of what feels like the actual police raid, complete with the sounds of gunfire, shouting, and desperate struggle. The experience is reportedly so realistic and traumatic that several visitors have required psychological counseling afterward. The house has also attracted attention from psychic mediums who claim to have made contact with the spirits that remain trapped there. According to these accounts, McCall's spirit is not alone. The house apparently holds the residual energy of all the trauma it witnessed, including the fear and desperation of the gang's victims, the servants who lived in terror, and even the police officers who participated in the deadly raid. These psychic investigations have revealed what researchers believe to be a complex spiritual ecosystem within the house. Multiple presences existing in various states of awareness and anger. Some appear to be mere emotional imprints, endlessly replaying their final moments. Others seem more conscious and interactive, responding to the presence of visitors with hostility and attempts at communication. The most unsettling aspect of these investigations is the suggestion that the house continues to accumulate spiritual energy from its reputation. Each visitor who enters with fear or morbid curiosity potentially adds to the dark atmosphere, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where the house becomes increasingly haunted by its own reputation. Will the Stander Gang's legacy ever rest in peace? As we reach the end of our journey into the dark history of the Stander Gang safehouse, we must confront the most disturbing question of all. Can such intense trauma ever truly be laid to rest? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Some violations of the natural order too severe to simply fade with time? The legacy of the Stander Gang extends far beyond their criminal activities or even the supernatural reputation of their former safehouse. Stander, who had traveled to America, likewise died in a shootout with police there on February 13, 1984. Hale had traveled to Britain, where he committed further robberies. The violence that began in the Houghton safehouse spread across continents, claiming lives and traumatizing communities, from Johannesburg to Fort Lauderdale to London. Hale fled to Europe and was later caught in England. The Gang of Three had become notorious, particularly after they robbed 3 banks in less than an hour in January 1984. Even after their separation and the deaths of his partners, Alan Hale continued the criminal legacy, as if the darkness that had consumed them in the Houghton safehouse had become a permanent part of his being, following him wherever he fled. As investigators continue to study the phenomenon, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The Stander Gang safehouse will likely never be just another house in an exclusive neighborhood. It will remain a dark landmark, a reminder of how human choices can create consequences that echo through time, affecting not just the immediate participants, but generations of people who will encounter its malevolent influence. And so ends our terrifying journey into the heart of Johannesburg's most haunted criminal safehouse. The Stander Gang's safehouse remains today what it became on that violent January morning in 1984. A place where the boundary between the criminal and the supernatural has been permanently shattered, where the past refuses to rest, and where the darkest chapters of human nature continue to play out in ways that defy rational explanation. The story of Andre Stander, Alan Hale, and Lee McCall serves as a chilling reminder that some crimes create consequences that extend far beyond the reach of earthly justice. Their reign of terror ended with bullets and blood, but the spiritual aftermath continues to unfold decades later, affecting everyone who encounters the dark legacy they left behind. Subscribe to The Haunted Lore wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review to help other seekers of the supernatural find us. And remember to follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content and updates on our latest investigations into the places where history's darkest moments refuse to stay buried. Until next time, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some houses never forget the horrors they've witnessed, and some stories refuse to end, even when everyone who lived them is long gone.